I think we have to become realistic again, what works and why. And we have already invented it. We don't need to do new things. If we are not comfortable with the nuclear energy when it comes to security of generation 2 or 3, I say, let's build generation 4. What we need is not just a grid that is stable and that works, and that we are struggling now because of some of the decisions that were made not just in Germany, but in other parts too. And because we're all connected now, we suffer all from the same problem that one part created, which is insane. But what we also need to be aware is that I think we need cheap prices. At the prices today, the average bakery will go bankrupt. Is that the innovation of the 2023 year, that we cannot produce cheap electricity anymore because we have a reduction of choices that now comes down to a few things that are good and everything else is bad? Well, I think people will adapt their opinion when it comes to good and bad very quickly, when they cannot afford the electricity or when they have their first blackout.
Welcome to Velina's talk. Today's guest is Alexander Stahel. We decided to use the German pronunciation, and this episode is dedicated to energy and geopolitics. Of course, the episode would not be possible without Bharatvaarta, one of the leading Indian podcast producers on politics, policy, and society. Thank you for that. And Alexander is an entrepreneur, and he has his own hedge fund covering and dealing with commodities investing. So welcome, Alexander. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Velina, for having me. This is fantastic. Nice.
And one of my most favorite topics from the last 2.5 years since I've started this podcast is energy. Energy is the linchpin of geopolitics, which is why I'm so delighted to welcome you to the podcast today. And I would like to start our conversation, of course, with oil and fossil fuels, since a lot has been ongoing in recent times, and mostly from a European perspective, it's about the European and the Western sanctions, given the ban on Russian crude oil starting from December 5. So I would like to first hear your opinion on this particular ban. How do you think this is going to work out? Do you expect that Russia will manage to bypass, of course, the sanctions, given the critical importance of the Russian crude oil purchases? Also, meanwhile, the European Union discussed the oil price cap of $62 US a barrel, but some of the member states, such as Poland, Estonia, and Lithuania, refused, arguing that it was too high. I would like you to comment on that as well.
Okay, so come 5th of December, the European sanctions will bite, and basically what it means is that all OECD European members, and also the American side, the Canadian side, and I call it self-sanctioned, the Korean, South Korean, and the Japanese will stop buying Russian crude. Now, just to be clear, so Russia is a big player in the crude market. For your audience that may be not so well aware of who is doing what there. So Russia produces about 10 million barrels per day. That is on a call it 85 million crude market and a 100, call it 2 million liquids market. So that includes LNG and includes biofuels and so on. So in that context, Russia is a powerhouse, equal size as Saudi Arabia and the US in terms of production. Now, when it comes to export, it's even more important because yes, Saudi Arabia exports about 7.5 or 7.1 million at the moment barrels per day. But Russia wasn't far behind. It was about 5.5 million crude barrels, but now comes in addition about 1 million products in the form of diesel or in the form of naphtha or other, call it finished products that we as human beings use. We don't use crude, right? We use products. So in that sense, Russia matters and those sanctions matter. So what happened over there since the sanctions were announced with the illegal invasion of of Ukraine, what happened is that already most of the countries that I mentioned in the beginning have reduced the buying of crude and products from Russia. Not so much on the product side, but certainly on the crude side. And yet we still have to go through the final stage in the next couple of days of that. And at the moment, Russia still delivers about 2.5 million crude barrels into Europe each day. Right now, those will have to come off in literally 3 days, and they will. And so where are these barrels going is the big question, right? Because what Europe bought before was actually more like 4 million, and what they reduced so far, more or less, has been reshifted, reallocated, mainly newly into India, because they didn't buy much crude from Russia at all before. And then secondly, a bit more into China. Chinese were always big crude buyers from Russia. And then some more into Turkey, and that more or less explains the reshuffling, right? So now one thinks, wow, this is a big world, and I'm sure they have a gazillion clients all over the place. Well, yes, but the European Union, I think that's important to hear once, is a 10 million per day crude purchase. And that makes it, together with China, the largest purchaser of crude oil in the world. And that is not easily replaceable, that purchasing power. And that's why we argued Russia will have, when I say we argued, I publish some of my views from time to time, as you know, on Twitter. I argued that it will be very hard for Russia come 5th of December to find a new home for the remaining barrels that they have not already reshuffled. Now, price can always do work in commodities, so the more discounts you give, suddenly you find economic buyers. And I wouldn't exclude that, but we argue for China. China is a very strategic purchaser of crude, so they like a diversified base from where they buy, as well as a diversified trading route from where they buy. So that's going to make it hard for China just to do a lot more from here. And then India can do a bit more, but they already now buy a lot. You know, they buy almost 1 million crude from Russia per day on a 4.5 million purchasing power. So that's a lot. And maybe they can do a bit more. And then Turkey is actually Mickey Mouse in the world of crude. And, they bought 200,000 barrels more. That's not much. So they cannot move the needle. And then we'll have to see now they negotiate with Pakistan, and we'll have to see where else that is going. But at the end of the day, there aren't big markets left when the South Korean, the Japanese, the US, and the Europeans stop buying it. So that's where the Russians are. And of course, they want to get rid of their crude. And then let me go to the second question, then we can wrap it up there. You said, so now there is this price cap idea. So what was the price cap supposed to do? Let's remind everyone in the first place. The reason, so first the Europeans in March said, wow, we have to do more sanctions to punish Russia, which I completely agree with, right? So take their, call it income away to weaken their war machine. And we should have done that 10 years ago, but okay. Let's do it now if we slept at the wheel now for 10 years. And then, so we do it now. And by doing so, at some point, mainly the Americans came and said, let's be a little careful here. They are such a large part of this seaborne crude market in terms of export barrels. Are we hurting ourselves more than we're hurting Russia? And so how about introducing a price cap, $60, $70, $50? Let's, at the moment it got $62 to $70, and I'll get to the positions in a second of the different actors that have to sign off on it. But the point there is, they said, if we introduce such a price cap, the idea is to reduce revenues for Russia, but to maximize the flows actually. Export flows. So it's not about taking barrels off market, it's about keeping barrels in the market, this whole price cap idea. So let's remind people what this idea is all about. And I have nothing against it. The ideal form of weakening Russia economically, or call it the Kremlin, right? This is not about us, Russia, and so the people. It's about the leaders of Russia, Vladimir Putin and his crooks, that do what they do, and so how do you weaken them? And of course, a price cap can be an idea. Now, In reality, however, it's unlikely that India and China will ever sign off to such a price cap. But that is not the point. The point is that when you introduce such a price cap, now China and India has actually purchasing power, or call it negotiating power. Now they go back to the Russians and say, oh, by the way, we're not just the only home for your barrels, but by the way, there is also a cap here in place that maybe we are being too generous to you what we are paying. And so in that sense, the idea is not, I like the idea, I think it can work. Now, the market has already discounted barrels out of Russia. They are called in our world Urals from when they come from the Baltics, and ESPO when they come from the Far East. And the ESPOs have their price and their roots, and they are not that much affected in the Far East, opposite Japan, what Russia does with China there. But on this side, on the European side, there is a big shift going on in the making. And Urals, although I don't have a daily quote because no one has, this is a very opaque market. It's not so easy to have a fixed quote, but what we see on Bloomberg and what we see on different price tables, Urals probably has a $20 discount to Brent already. So that's a lot. So it's now, in fact, below the price of what is currently discussed in terms of price cap, that 62 to 63, when I think the fair price at the moment for the barrel is probably 58, 55, what is paid when the Indians buy from the Russians. I'm not privy to those contracts, but that's probably around the price they pay, and then they have to transport them in. So then there are the Europeans, some of them involved in shipping and some of them not involved in shipping, right? And the shipping nations call it the Greeks and the Cyprus and the Malta guys say, oh, well, let's have a generous price cap because we want to keep those ships going. Why is that? Because the price cap comes with an insurance package, so to speak, from the London insurance market, the Lloyd's insurance market, which provides what is called P&I insurance, which is, let's say it this way, 95% of insurance that goes on ship when it comes to not just insuring the ship, but also possible damage a ship can do. And in terms of crude, that's very important because you remember some of the disasters that happened in the past, they can become very costly exercises, especially if they happen in the wrong location. Imagine going through the Suez Canal and you have an oil spill. You probably block the channel for months. That has big ramifications, right? And someone will have to pay for that. And those are massive bills we're talking. And so who is insuring that? And if the sanctions come effective on the 5th of December, practically no Russian ship can insure in the international insurance market of London. Done, finished, end of story. And that's a big thing, a very big thing. It's in fact the one thing that is the hardest to understand how it really will work, and it is that everything that matters in this entire game here. So now Russia has its own fleet, and the Indians and some Chinese have their own fleet, and so what are they going to do? They probably going to provide, call it a parental guarantee, call it a state guarantee, call it some state insurance out of India or out of China for their ships that make sure that Egypt or Turkey at the Bosporus is fine to say, okay, I let that ship pass through my waters because I'm fine, someone will pay the bill if something goes wrong. However, everyone prefers the international insurance package on a ship that transports crude. And now the cap is more or less saying, by the way, here is the cap, don't sell for more than, say, $60 Russian oil. Again, it's at the moment below that market price. But if you do that, you can, in fact, still insure in the London Lloyd's market for tankers. And if you don't do, you cannot. And that's why the Greeks say, oh, please, let's keep that cap generous so we get some of that business and we can use some of our ships that are insured and that now legally transport not to Europe crude. No European country will come in. Call it the EU sanction overrides, supersedes, call it the price cap sanction, right? It's not that crude in the future will come back into Europe because suddenly that price cap, when you adhere to it, you can now purchase crude in Italy from Russia. That's not the point. The point is that the shippers can do the business bringing Urals from the Baltics into India or something like that. right? And so here are the Poles, the other side, that say, you know what, those Russians, they really get on our nerves, right? They've done so for the last 60 years. And we don't like this entire cap thing at 60. Let's do 30. And that's what their position is right now. And I'm not privy of the meetings, but that's the last number that came out of this. And here is the Polish side, right? They actually have a strong hand. I tweeted that a week ago. Put yourself in the shoes of the Poles. They say, well, if I don't so first of all, every European member, and I hope I explained well to the audience because it's a little complex and I'm jumping here, but I hope at the end of the day it all makes sense. So every European member has to sign up, one vote each. Everyone has to unanimously sign to that contract in order for the price cap to get to work. And so the Poles have one voice and can block everything now. Of course, the Estonians and the Latvians and so on, they're in the same kind of boat with the Poles. And they say, no, look, the Russian guys, the bad guys, no. We don't like the cap at 60. That's a joke. They make too much money. They make, let's do 30 or otherwise let's not do it. And here they have a very strong hand because they can effectively say, you know what, we didn't agree, bad luck, there is no price cap. And then, so what happens in the reality in the market is that for sure you have less ships available come 5th of December to transport whatever oil is left to be transported from west to east. That is not already going from west to east. And so the Poles can just sit there and say, I like 30. Guys, sorry, that's anything else, if the contract doesn't fly, it all goes back to that, and therefore they win. And that's why I think they have a strong hand. Now, some people like maybe you, Velina, would say, yes, but there is this American voice. And they obviously want to have a friendly relation with the Americans, and so they somehow will come to the table on some number. And it's possible that they finally say, okay, it's 70 was never the number, but 60 we kind of agree, or 55. To be honest, if I'd be the guy in the room and I had to bring everyone together, I would at least have 55, if not 50. And that's if the Russians don't like it, you know what, bad luck for you guys. Now comes Yellen again, who initiated the idea, the American Treasury Secretary, and says, no, but guys, you don't understand, with the whole idea was not to have less oil flowing and have a shock in the West that punishes us or hurts us more than it hurts the Russians. And I would say, let's be careful there. There will, at 55, they are desperate. Let's put it this way. Let me start differently. Putin has already decided that he stops the gas flows to Europe. So he loses a lot of money there. And everyone said, when I said it 12 months ago, he will do that. Everyone said, you're crazy. You don't understand economics. He wants the prices to be high and then sell the gas. And I said, no, he doesn't care that much about economics. He cares about his, call it political painting that he's trying to paint in his last endeavor at whatever age he has. I think, what is he now? Velina 70 or something. And so I'm saying, so he cut off the gas, so that revenue is not coming in. I mean, there is some gas flowing, but not that much anymore into Europe, right? And then he has the metal side, where they are large exporters, Russia, but that is already a break-even business. We here, because we do a lot with metals too, or at least we have our ears near to it. We hear that's already a break-even business at the moment as it is. So there is certainly no excess revenue coming into the Russian coffers there, or the Kremlin coffer. And then we have the oil side, which really matters. And I think that keeps, call it the carousel, the merry-go-round going. And so I think it's, they can posture and say, of course, their side, posture the meeting and said, if there is a price cap, we will not deliver any oil. And so there is the oil shock. That's easier said than done in their shoes, because they clearly suffer. And I think they have to get that oil out. And if you pay attention to the latest comments of Lavrov, you also see that, no, they want to get the oil going and he doesn't really care about the cap. This is all, bilateral agreements and so on. So I think they will try and get every barrel out they possibly can. And that's what I think will happen. I'm not sure we're going to have that cap or not, and what the final price will be. 62 to me, again, is a bit generous. I think 55 is fine, because you want to say, okay, where is the cost of the Russian production? It's probably subject to feel between $20 and $40 at the moment. So you want to introduce max paying there, and yet an incentive for them to keep it flowing. So 55 to me sounds like a sensible number. So they keep the barrel going. To me, 62 is a little bit too generous, but let's see what the polls end up doing. If they walk from this negotiation, and then we're not going to have a cap, and therefore we're not going to have insurance access for shipping, and therefore what the Russians primarily have is a transportation problem, right? Because they simply don't have the fleet to transport the additional oil from that now Europe doesn't buy anymore from the Baltics into the eastern, wherever they may find a home. I'm not even sure they find a home, as I explained earlier, but if they find a home in Pakistan, says, okay, China says, here is an SPR, increased strategic petroleum reserve, let's do something there, a one-off kind of thing. I don't think they have the transportation capacity. So that's a little bit where I see the puzzle. But to be honest, there are so many moving parts at the moment that it's really hard to see how it all pans out. And, it's kind of the category too hard to call exactly to see how it pans out. But we'll know more in about 4 weeks' time when we have the numbers in, and then we can say exactly.
Of course, it will very much depend also on the ongoing war that Russia has been waging against Ukraine, for sure, because, as you said, China and India will not stick to an oil price cap, for sure, given their independence in foreign policy decisions. Just for the sake of having an independent foreign policy, they will not stick to this, let's say, Western proposal. This will be my call on the matter as of today. But in 4 weeks of now, or in 2 months from now, when we have, let's say, a very different scenario on the ground, we may also see more, let's say, readiness for a compromise. Who is going to compensate for the missing oil on the European markets?
I think if we lose 1 million right now in this scenario, given the demand outlook weakens mainly everywhere in the east of Suez, versus the America is kind of fine and Europe is weakening, then demand will be one answer, and some will be can be compensated by OPEC. Look, OPEC at the moment discusses a cut because they see weakness. We see weakness in the prices, so we can measure that in the form of what is the spot versus what is 3 or 6 months ahead price. And Brent there is in what we call a contango. That gives you an incentive to store barrels in storage rather than to bring them immediately to the market. And so that's a sign of weakness, right? And we haven't had that now in 18 months or almost 24 months. So the market is not screaming bullish, right? Now, America is very healthy, but that's the one place in the market where at the moment demand is normal. Okay, demand is China just had a very strong November because they increased runs quickly. But the way the Chinese market works is now they call it a natural a marketplace like Europe or like America. It's a CCP says let's do this now marketplace. And they just decided October, November to be strong. That's not a reflection of what the people do on the ground. And many people mix that up. So there are two different things. Anyway, so the market is not particularly, is not getting stronger for sure. It's, if anything, is getting weaker. So there will be some compensation there. And then OPEC, of course, could compensate some of that. But then in some cases, it may be, again, a tighter market. Therefore, you have a price signal that shoots up. It's not my expectation that we're going to have a huge price spike, up from 85 or whatever Brent right now is, back to 125 in the next 3 months, but I couldn't exclude it. It's really a tricky market to read and subject to the barrels that flow. And I'll make these calls, as we get closer to the numbers. I mean, for something we collect all this real-time data so that we can make decisions.
Any scenarios where there would be also, let's say, black market opportunities for Russian oil blend? because we know that it is a certain one that also has to cover some certain demand in United States and in Europe. So it's not like you can replace, let's say, just the quantity. It's sometimes also about the quality, right? And you don't have so many options to diversify away. Are there any kind of scenarios where we would see Russian oil being shipped under international flag, or let's say, through partners in crime? Do you expect such a scenario? We've seen this in the past with Iranian oil or with the oil from Venezuela. So Russia is certainly an experienced player when it comes to bypassing sanctions. Still, we need to remind that these Western sanctions have been the most severe ones, but are not the first ones. And Russia has been already sanctioned following the first invasion of Ukraine in 2014.
So, Velina, this entire shadow or black market in oil is certainly real, right? And there is no two ways about it. And in the case of where we can measure it, the numbers are never as dramatic as some of the chattering classes make it up to. And my view, honestly, I'm very careful there and very prudent about my predictions, because I often feel that people predict things just to sound insiderish and to sound like we know a lot more than most, and behind the scene kind of thing. And I'm always a little careful when I hear these kind of voices. What we can measure, and we have tools to measure, right? Whatever goes in a ship, and we can really measure it, not to perfection, but in the masses, right? I mean, the cheating goes on the margin, not in the mass, right? And we're talking massive amounts here. I would be careful to predict too much. But here is the thing, Velina. This doesn't have to be black market. What it can be is it can be oil going to India and coming back in the form of diesel to Europe, and that's completely legal. So let's not be too dramatic. Let's not sound too clever. I think that's just what's going to happen, number one. And now the question is, how much can the Indian refinery system increase capacity, or the Chinese one, and what is the capacity available in terms of ships? And there is a big bottleneck there, because when it comes to product tankers, the market is even tighter, and you're just not going to reshuffle 2 million barrels into China to then bring back 2 million barrels in the form of diesel overnight. Not going to happen, not going to fly, ships not going to be there, right? So yes, on the margin, you're going to have some of that, right? Chinese, call it Russian crude going to China or India and coming back in the form of diesel produced by these guys. And the Chinese, by the way, have excess capacity to do that. They could easily do that, and they could matter. And then let's not forget, the Middle East also just brings on a new refinery in Kuwait, a large one, massive one, which can help on the product side when the sanctions kick in on the product side on the 5th of February. And so we'll have to see how much of that would then, maybe they use some external crude when they don't have to. I don't know. I don't think so, but the UAE is often cited as a market like that brings in additional stuff from what they already produce to because they have some refinery excess capacity. In general, when it comes to European players, to private actors, I will be very careful if I'd be them. Because the judiciary in Europe, the European court, has tooth. I mean, how much money can you make to waste it all and be in prison, right? So I don't know. Maybe I'm too Swiss for that, but everyone that cheats obviously assumes they're not going to get caught, and I'd be very careful here in the European context, because there are plenty of Eastern Europeans that are happy to catch you cheating. Right, and then you have a big issue at hand. So I'd be very careful in the European context. And now the Chinese don't need to cheat. The Indian can do what they want. Many big countries can do what they want. The Japanese look at it differently. They need some, or don't use at the moment. And if they use, they will say it because they are not restricted. So are the South Koreans. And the Americans don't need anyone. I think cheating is an element, but let's not over forecast it for the moment. If someone says, I tell you something, 5.5 million barrels were exported and they're all going to continue flowing because this black market will flourish, I say that's rubbish. Either we're going to have a price cap, and then we have the shipping capacity, because the price cap allows for shipping capacity to come in with the right insurance, and then those barrels can flow to the east, and we'll see how much homes they find, and then I say we lose 500,000 barrels. If we don't have insurance coverage, I think we lose a million barrel, because it's hard to find a home, and we don't have the ships. And then some of that will over time be recompensated in the black market, but that needs time, and the black market is not established on January 6th.
Well, for me personally, the big question mark, and I also don't have an answer to that, remains the lockdown situation in China, because we know very well that the moment when China decides to loosen the lockdown policy following the failed zero COVID approach, there will be a surge in the demand and production and so on. So it will be obviously linked to growing energy demand. And the other question mark is but we don't have an answer to that. So we see some signs, some political statements, but we still don't have an answer as to how long it will take for the Chinese to admit, specific for the Chinese Communist Party to admit that the whole lockdown policy has been a blunder, and they will have to at some point have to open. And the second big question mark remains the Indian case. Of course, you are absolutely right. 100% growth in demand, namely from 2% to 4%, is not really it's a tremendous, of course, surge, but at the very same time we don't know exactly how much more will come from the Indian demand for Russian oil. That is, I think, still an open question mark, and of course there is no coming back when it comes to the European sanctions on oil. Now, moving to the next, of course, interesting case, and that is the gas.
Yeah, maybe
Yes.
one addition to what you just said. I think something I can add, which I think people, especially in some of the communities where we exchange information, I think get too lightly, right? So first, you and me, we don't buy oil, we buy products, and the refinery system buys crude. Now, the Chinese refinery system just bought about 2 million barrels per day more crude in November. It did already. So I would be very surprised if there is an impetus, a positive one, coming from an opening up. I think it's already there. And I think that's the big difference. So it's a weaker market, but the impetus, as if it's open, is already there. I think, if anything, it probably comes down, because the refineries don't have the quota to buy much more. Again, this is all dictated from the CCP, and then I think we have a weaker January and February, regardless of opening, not opening. Even if tomorrow someone says to me, by the way, here's the playbook, everyone can do what they want, that's not going to change the purchasing behavior of a refiner. It's actually the quota allocation by the CCP that will, and the refinery runs at the moment on max. They are very high right now. And so, if anything, I think they come down first and then maybe go up again in the summer a little bit. But look, I think China underneath has all these economic problems and the bubble and the property bubble to digest and so on. So I think China will not become this growth story that it has been now for 15 years in crude. And I think, if anything, China is probably ex-growth now for the next, call it, decade. They have to go through a similar period as Japan did when they had to digest their bubble, and I think that will have ramification, because property is 35% of the GDP of China, so that is a big pill to swallow and digest. So that's just my call it a wrap up of China, and then one can look into more detail.
Certainly very important to follow, and critical clarification on your side. Let's move to the gas question. Now, we have also European and Western sanctions on Russian gas, given that around 150 to 200 billion cubic meters were practically imported to Europe, and the decision from this summer was to cut off at least 2/3 from the Russian gas. How are you evaluating the current situation? What are the main signals to follow? Also, the most important developments as of December. Let's highlight that Europe was already in an energy crisis before the war began. So obviously, Russia's war against Ukraine was not the cause for the energy crisis on the old continent, but was certainly an amplifier. And how do you, as I said, assess the current situation, but also what are the main developments that you are paying attention to?
Okay, let me try and characterize a little bit the European gas market. So it's a 450 BCM, billion cubic meter market in 2019 on the demand side. Of that, 180 BCM, billion cubic meter, came from Russia by way of pipelines, 3 pipelines, North Sea, and then there was the Brotherhood and the Yamal, and Belarus, and then Ukraine. And the entire European gas system was more or less built around that because it was such a large part. Then there is also our own production. So Norway is a powerhouse when it comes to gas and gas production. It produces about 115 BCMs per year, which is massive. And then, it's almost the size of Russia. And then there is the UK, which has a lot of capacity, but almost every other country also has, in fact, quite some capacity. They use it more or less, but the Romanians, for instance, produce 9 BCM, which is fantastic. And then, Hungary a little less. So you can go through each, but there is local production and potentially is everywhere, including Germany, France, Spain, everywhere, Italy. Everyone could produce more if they wanted. So then we also have pipeline systems coming in from north of Africa, and that goes into Spain and into Italy. That helps some. And then we had some gas now newly for the last couple of 3 years coming in from Azerbaijan. And that's how Europe was supplied. And then came the war. And now what happened is that we more or less lost most of what Russia provided. So in 2019, it was 180 BCMs. And if by the year end, when everything is said and done, it's going to be 62 BCMs. And by next year, that 62 goes probably down to 20 BCMs. Now, there is still some LNG coming in from Russia, 20 BCMs each year, which could be at risk too, by the way, but that's also the last part that comes in from Russia. But next year, I expect some pipeline and LNG shipping from Russia to be around 40 BCMs, which means we need to find other sources because Norway cannot suddenly produce much more. That's impossible. An offshore gas project takes years to develop, first to find and then develop and take on and then bring in. And so there's nothing short term there in terms of own production. So what you do is you bring in more LNG, liquefied natural gas. So that's when you cool down the gas to make it more dense. So you can bring it on a ship and bring a lot of gas in one ship, which, by the way, the Japanese invented in 1975 and made it a market since. And it became a massive market for the overall gas market, for the global gas market today. And so Europe imported in 2019, for comparison, about 115, again, a similar amount as from Norway through the pipes in the form of LNG. And in this year, this number will be about 160 BCMs. So we increased that number significantly, which wasn't easy because we didn't have the right infrastructure to just scale it up. Now, those terminals to bring in the gas, they are called regas terminals because they kind of have to heat up the gas again from the cooling to get it in the form where we can use it. And those terminals we had plenty of, but we had them at the wrong locations. So a lot in Spain, and Spain didn't have good connections into France. And so what Spain had, we couldn't fully use. So the utilization there was low because we wouldn't know how to bring it into the continent. And so you had different stories for different parts of Europe. We are optimizing that at the moment, and I think Europe does an okay job. I would see it even faster, even better in some places, but this is now not about going through each. but it works. So we have capacity to bring in 160, no problem. Here comes the thing. Next year, because again, we still had more flows this year from Russia. Remember, the Nord Stream went off in July, not early in the year, but still, so we had half a year of flows from Nord Stream and so on. So next year we have to compensate more Russian losses, and that means according to our calculation, we assume we have to bring in 210 BCM by way of LNG. So now it gets interesting, Velina, because the question is, where do you find that LNG? Where does it come from? And there, what I think your audience really needs to understand, so far Europe contracted LNG on the spot market. So that's American LNG, which has contract destination freedom, that is, let's say, owned by Trafigura, the trading house here in Geneva, and they were supposed to deliver that LNG, let's say, to, they are free to use it for whatever they want to use it, but let's say they were planning to deliver it to India or Pakistan, and now they can fetch a higher price in Europe, and so they're happily delivering it to Europe. And that's what we did now all year long, and that's why the price signal is so important. The higher the price, the more gas you attract from the free contracts available in the LNG spot market. Now going from 160 to 210 next year, the question is, where is this additional LNG in the spot market to be found? And the answer is, I don't know. And it's not just
no one knows.
No one knows. Right? It's not there. It's just not. We cannot just say, here it's suddenly there is. We didn't look quite rightly, right, before. But now that I look, I discovered it. No, we already know there is not that much capacity just freely available. Now we can again, with high prices, try to buy it away from someone, but we need someone to give it to us. And here is a bit the problem. So in LNG there are three large producers or exporters of LNG, and that's the United States, it's Australia, which is irrelevant because that stays in Asia due to shipping capacity again, and then it's Qatar. And Qatar has no destination freedom in the contract. So if India, Sinopec, has a contract with Qatar for an annual 20 million tons of LNG, right, which is about, call it 30 BCMs of LNG, they can only use it to bring it into China, according to the contract, which is different from the States. They can do, Trafigura can do with it what it wants, or Shell or BP that put that stuff. Here, you need to bring it to China from Qatar. China can say, no, we understand you Europeans need the gas desperately. I'll hand back my contract to Qatar, and Qatar can sell it for the higher price to Europe. Now, I ask you back, why would China do that exactly? Why would they give away the cheap contract that they have from Qatar and instead using it for themselves? And that's exactly the problem. They will not. They will use it for themselves. Now, Sinopec may try to resell it later on, but that's not so easy according to the contract. So they maybe can free up some other contracts that are not with Qatar, but it all gets very messy now. It's very theoretical, and you have to go around corners and more and more. So we think it's getting tight to find 210 BCMs next year. It's not impossible, but tight. And I think that's why I think the real crisis for gas really only starts in 23. This was kind of Vorspiel, shocks coming, media news, Nord Stream was blown up, sabotage, so on and so forth. Prices spiked and reacted emotionally. But here now we really get into the demand and supply crunch, where we not only need higher prices in Europe to attract the LNG, but we also need a bit of luck to even find that much LNG, and the alternative is to simply save. Now, some very clever people will say, and we can save, because there is fat in the system. And usually that's true, that's not a wrong statement, but we already took out fat this year. And not that little, right? This year we probably on the demand side, in all, when everything is said and done by end of December, we took out 13% of demand in Europe to balance the market this year. And if we have to take out, those additional 40 BCMs would bring us to about 20% or 22% that we have to kind of save in demand. I say, well, now you may be cut into the bone. It's not going to be that. I don't know these things. They are difficult to answer because we obviously have across Europe, it's a little different, but let's say the formula for the entirety of Europe is about 50% goes into households, 30% goes into the industry, and the rest is, call it, commercial use, the little bakery, somewhere, the bakery downstairs in the building, and these kind of. So the household is protected almost everywhere in Europe. So you cannot just take the gas away. You can try and incentivize him to take away, to use less of it by having higher prices. But that's exactly what we don't do in Europe at the moment, right? We subsidize prices. We try to protect the poor household, which I completely understand where politicians come from. But I'm just warning, it certainly doesn't send an incentive to save gas to consumers. Now the politicians go further and say, don't worry, we're going to introduce laws so that the consumer, the school building cannot use so and so much, or should be at 9 degrees and so on. And that all sounds very clever, but I think, Velina, it's going to be extremely hard to implement, because you cannot, as a utility, you cannot address individual households and take away more or less gas. That's not the way the system was ever built. So you kind of have to see how that all pans out and who uses how much when it really gets cold. So that's number one. And then number two, we have the industry. They were probably bearing the brunt of what we don't do. So the industry includes the industry itself, right? But also the electrification of gas, so the power system. And there, we were already careful in use and scaled back because of prices. But also there, they are only now feeling the pass-on of higher prices because many utilities were hedged before, were not able or allowed by law to pass on higher prices and start now. So they say, for instance, in the UK, the price spike from October, I think, or September into February will be something like 250%, where they first time start to pass on the higher prices. And then you have to see how the use is going to be curtailed, and probably that helps. But that also means deindustrialization, right? Because at those prices, many, if you're BASF and you produce chemical products, the largest chemical maker in Europe, you cannot just swallow these prices. You probably have to say, look, here is the strategic decision. We do more of it in the US and less of it in Europe, and that's not good for Europe either, right? And so maybe the question there then is, so how do we solve this crisis? Because I was just explaining the Russian gas is gone and will not come back, in my personal opinion, in the way it was there. A, for the pipeline reasons that now was sabotaged, but B, also because of the political decision in the Kremlin. And on that basis, you have to say, so where is the gas coming from in the future? And it will have to be an LNG market, and it will have to be a combo of savings also on the demand side, and electrifying what we can, and so on and so forth. Because it takes Switzerland, we don't use that much gas anymore, right? And there are other countries that still do a lot with gas that maybe not necessarily a gas utility, but it could be electricity too. So I think that's what we need to do. We need to shift there. And then in terms of addressing the price, so there is a very simple fact there. We need to, rather than acting on the LNG spot market, we need to, or the utilities need to sign up long-term contracts with Qatar, the United States, African providers, in order to get the price that is cost plus something, right? If you are buying in the spot market, you're paying a market price that is kind of bid up from the different players within a specific context, like a deep winter, cold weather, and now everyone needs it, right? If you are having a long-term contract, you can agree on a price mechanism for 10, 15, 20 years. And that usually is a lower price than what you see in the market price in the LNG spot market. And that's the recipe for Europe to get there. Now, your audience may ask, so why didn't we do that already? We know exactly what we need to replace. Let's say we need to replace some 150 BCMs of Russian gas. So where are the long-term contracts? Because it's not that Qatar and the US and so on cannot scale up the business. I mean, not tomorrow, but by 26, we can absolutely have the scale back from all sides to have long-term contracts and replace every single Russian molecule. But for that, they will want to have long-term contracts. And the long-term contracts are not signed at the moment, in my view, mainly because of climate laws that say, by the way, by 2050, we all want you to be net zero, no CO2 emissions. Now, gas has CO2 emissions, so that's not the choice you can take. And that's why the utilities are call it in, sitting on the fence rather than making decisions where they say, look, we'd like your gas, but only for 10 years. And the Qataris say, guys, this is an investment that we can amortize only over 20 years, scaling up this field or adding these and these export terminal capacities for LNG. So you guys have to commit for 15 or 20 or 25 years, ideally. The European utilities struggled to do so. When they, by the way, did so for Russia, which is funny, right? They all had long-term contracts with Gazprom, but here we're struggling to repeat what we should do. And I hope at some point in 23, everyone clicks and says, by the way, climate law, no climate law, we will need gas for a long time to come. We can replace so and so much of it. We can probably reduce some of our demand pattern in the future. But at the end of the day, we need gas for a long time to come, be it for fertilizers, be it for electrification, because the grid has been built that way, or be it because commercial residential housing needs heat and needs a fireplace, and so we better get on with it. And we are not there yet, and the reason is that the politicians are awfully slow to accept the reality of how this world works. And many live in the fantasy land of tomorrow that they like to build, but that will in reality, this energy transition is just a thing that takes time. It's really, you're not going to change the system in 2.5 decades. It's probably a question of 5, 6, 7, 8 decades.
So maybe to wrap it up, this year should be rather safe, but 2023 is the year in which we will see more turmoil regarding the gas. Conservative estimates point to missing around 40 to 50 BCM for the moment. So obviously there is still a huge gap which the current demand cannot cover. And given the fact that, as you rightfully pointed out, that Russian gas is not going to cover it as well, unless there are once again unorthodox ways of Russian gas deliveries to European market via the black market. There is no way how to fill this gap in the short term. Maybe a final question regarding gas before we move also to nuclear and renewables, because I really want to hear your opinion, your assessment on nuclear and the renewables as critical components of the energy mix. Do you think that the current storage reserves average beyond 90% for the European Union in general, and most of the member states also with quite high storage reserves for gas? Do you think that this is the whole story, or are we really safe for this winter?
Thank you for asking the question. No, so storage. So Europe needs flows in order to go through a winter. So in the winter we need about 2.5, 3 times the gas that we use in the summer, or even in some cases more than that, subject to where the country is. And so you need flow and storage withdrawals. And so the storage that we have, 90% full is great. But it should not be the quoted number. The quoted number should be how many days you have in storage to provide for the winter. And so the average storage in Europe at the moment carries us 2 months. So from here to end of January, and then the storage is empty. Now we're not going to use it all at once, because we still have flows from Norway, from Northern Africa, and from LNG. But it's always the combination that takes us through the winter demand. So if we have more flow interruption, suddenly it gets funny on storage, because then you use more storage than you otherwise planning to use. Look, there are many scenarios one can do. At the moment, we have one where if the weather is kind of normalized weather as we had in the last 4 years, and we have the flows that we currently have, we will be fine to get through April as a European Union, all of the countries more or less, right? But if the weather is getting very cold, colder than average, like I think it was the 16 winter or 17, don't quote me on that, then suddenly you would probably quickly get to the storage bottom, meaning you could end up having, especially in a country like Austria, which the storage is there not just for Austria but also for the Eastern European countries. You could quickly get to the point where storage runs at the lower limit or even runs out. It's never going to run out completely because you keep some working storage in it to keep the system under pressure. But you cannot say we are fine because it's 90%. We are fine, meaning until January for sure. Then we have flows in addition, which should easily carry us through a normal winter. I would subscribe to that. But if the winter is not normal, or if there is more interruption, similar kind of interruption as we saw with Nord Stream 1, if there is an attack on a Norwegian pipeline, then you quickly have issues. And I mean serious issues, right? Then we need to save more. And the way you would do that is, I don't think ever a household in Europe, for your audience, will freeze, right? I think what happens is that you simply shut down more of the industrial part. That's where you get the sacrifices in, because the households, obviously, when it comes to the livelihood of people, you'll protect that at all costs, and we should be fine there. But it's awkward, right? We have an awkward market, we have awkward situations, we have sky-high prices in such a scenario, so it's going to hurt. But it's not that someone, I think, will have to freeze this winter, right?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So, final question, maybe just to present the whole picture. Of course, next to fossil fuels, a lot has been happening on the side of nuclear and specifically renewables. Surge in the renewables given the Western sanctions on Russian oil and gas, for sure. What is your outlook for 2023, given that we have a very strong dichotomy, very, very big dividing line between European Union member states, because some of them are still relying a lot on nuclear energy. And then we have a group of member states, among which Germany, Austria, which are strongly against nuclear. And of course, then we have also the decision by the European Commission that nuclear next to LNG and to gas should be considered as one of the components of the energy mix towards green transition, which of course resulted in a huge outcry in specifically these countries that I named that are vehemently against nuclear. So what is your outlook for nuclear? Do you think that this dividing line will increase? And also for renewables, do you think that this 2050 goal of practically the first continent being carbon neutral is a realistic one? Because if I listen to the technical energy experts, all of them are sharing the same opinion about renewables, that practically a share of renewables above 50% in the energy mix of a state would immediately lead to a series of blackouts and will create serious problems for this state. But as I said, these are the technical energy experts. I'm not a technical energy expert, which is why I would like to also hear your opinion. Obviously, we are going towards a scenario in which renewables as a share of the energy mix of each and every European member state, and also, of course, all European states will increase. But then again, it will be not equally dispersed. Some will be champions. Austria, for instance, is one of the top when it comes to electricity production based on hydropower. Right, we still have around 1/4 of share coming from gas for the electricity production, but the rest is actually 75% is actually no longer dependent on fossil fuels, then again we have very different solutions among the member states. So I would like to hear what is your assessment on that kind of renewables outlook for Europe.
Okay, I'll try to wrap it up shortly, and apologies if not everything then immediately is intuitively clear, but I try to keep it short here in the interest of time, but it's obviously a big question you ask. The thing is, so our grid in Europe is let me just make sure some basics are very clear. We have what is called a synchronous grid in the continent of Europe, so from Africa to Turkey, from Denmark to the Sicily, they are synchronized, meaning one issue in one corner is the issue of everyone in any other corner. Or the other way around, we can help each other nicely this way. And so it's all connected. We're also connected with the UK and the Scandies, but not synchronized, right? We exchange electricity, but their grid is independent from our continental grid. Number one. Number two, for your audience, important, let's remind the basics first. This is, electroengineering. This is not emotions here. So electricity is about the asset that produces it. Electricity is about the timing. You constantly have to match consumption with production. And when I say constantly, I mean minute by minute. And then number three, it's about the location of the asset. So where electricity is produced is not necessarily consumed. And if the further away you need to transport it, the more you need to have the infrastructure in place. Now in Europe, we obviously have a lot of transmission lines, high voltage, mid voltage, low voltage, all sorts of voltage. But we didn't create the grid over the last 60 years to transport renewable energy produced offshore Germany into Bavaria on a extreme event for high wind or no wind the next moment and so on. So this entire renewable shift needs a lot of addressing on the infrastructure side when it comes to transmission lines, not just storage. So where are we there when it comes to these renewable assets? And when I talk renewables, I now mean wind and solar. I don't mean hydro. Hydro in all over Europe, we do since the days we invented electricity. So Switzerland does hydro. That's where electricity came from pre-World War I, right? And since then we have only expanded on that, and so did Sweden or Norway, or actually Austria has a lot of hydro, and France and the Alpine nations made use of the gifts they had. And only later, in the 50s and 60s, we started to build nuclear as the most energy dense and most powerful form of energy known to mankind. And then later on, we optimized for different ideas, and obviously fossil fuels had a big role, because coal is actually call it a very cheap way of producing electricity, because it's very easy for us today with the advanced technology we have to produce an efficient coal power plant. We can build it quickly. Within 2 years, we build such a coal plant, we put it there, it works, and that's why China builds one after the other, because they need a lot of new electricity. And that can be done fast and efficient and very, very cheap. While a nuclear project is something that we used to do in 7 years, and now we get to 20 years, because everyone has, by the way, this and this and this, so that we make them absolutely safe. So these projects take a lot of time. And then hydro you have or you don't have. If you don't have it, you cannot do it. Just so that's not a question of what you like, but what you have. Okay, so that's the mix we're in. And at the moment, Europe produces about 26% of the electricity mix in 2021 came from nuclear. And then coal was about 15%. And then natural gas power plants, which are extremely flexible, were about 17%. And then the renewables, actually wind and solar, provided about 18% of the European continental grid, synchronized grid electricity mix. Now, the problem with renewables is that when the wind doesn't blow and when the sun doesn't shine, which is what we call in German eine Dunkelflaute, then these assets cannot produce. And yet, as I was explaining before, minute by minute, we need to match the demand with the supply. So what do we do? So we need those fossil fuel sources, mainly gas and coal, to step in and help what the renewables cannot do, because we don't have the electricity storage, the battery storage, to do that minute by minute. We have some mechanical storage in the form of pumped storage, but that's very little in the European context. So if for the whole of Europe, it's about 1.4%. So it will never matter. We don't have the relevance, so we will not be able to transform the European landscape into pumped storage, mechanical storage, because it will never be able to release the electricity within the minutes we need it, but it will be within hours or days. So it's never the solution. So we need the grid-scale battery solutions. And those are not technologically ready yet. They will be over time. I cannot tell you when. Everyone works on that. Everyone wants to help there. Everyone wants to have the genius idea. But the one big battery Elon Musk built, which was called Victoria in Australia, has just started now on the way of developing it, building it, putting it there. It burned down once. Right, so it's still what I call a prototype 5, right? It's very early days. It's not the plane you and I want to sit in and say with our family, oh, let's fly from here to there and we are safe, right? No, you're not. There is, I don't know, a 30% chance the whole thing burns down, meaning the plane comes down, and that's just not what we can do when it comes to electricity, because electricity is the most important of all commodities. If you don't have electricity, if you have a blackout, a society is said within 4 weeks to be in the Stone Age. So everything goes very wrong very quickly. If you don't have oil, if you cannot drive your car, it's awkward. Everyone's angry. Everyone is like ashamed or outspoken about it, but no one dies, right? When it comes to electricity, people die, and quickly. And I'm not saying that to sound dramatic. I'm just saying it's as important as nothing else in our world, modern world.
So, sorry for interrupting you, because you made a very important remark, and I am using your definition of electricity to explain also to our audience how important it is to understand what Russia has been doing most recently in Ukraine, because it could not militarily succeed on the battle front. So this is exactly what Russian strategy has been for, let's say, last few months, namely to destroy the critical infrastructure that provide for the electricity, because as you rightfully explained, this means people die. No electricity, no heating, no water, no internet. So you have a full cycle that does not hit just businesses, but results in human loss. So I really use this opportunity to clarify this, because I think it's also important to understand how critical electricity is, next to, of course, the energy mix of countries. So electricity is the absolute linchpin of the existence, human survival, and existence of states.
Yeah, if you make a Maslow pyramid of commodities, electricity is always the first. Always, 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 and nothing comes. And then the second is gas, and the third then is at some point oil, and then copper, and then bauxite, and whatever. But, electricity is incredible. And that's why the Russians do what they do. And it should actually be part of the Geneva Convention not to allow to do that, or at least to treat it as a criminal act, a war crime, as you do when you use gas on the battlefield, as we did in the First World War. It's exactly the same criminal behavior, and that's exactly why they do it. So it's because sadly it's very effective. Now, again, so going back to our grid, so here, so the renewables can become a more important part, and some of them are more, call it meaningful, and some are very meaningless in terms of, call it resource allocation. So I'm not a big fan of solar, because they consume a lot of resources when it comes to the metal side, and we don't have too many of them. and at the same time their productivity, so they call it the capacity factor, that they can help in the European context climate. They can have like 14 or 15% efficiency in Spain. But in Germany, Switzerland, Austria, that quickly collapses to 7, 8, 9%. Sometimes when you have a good summer, you have 11%. But it's always awful when compared to an average nuclear plant that can provide at 90% capacity factor electricity. It needs very little resource, needs very little space, needs very little resource, because uranium is such a powerful atom, such a powerful element in the periodic system when it comes to energy density. And that's why, for me, I can absolutely not understand the countries that want to exclude nuclear from the energy mix, because A, they will not get there. They will have failure after failure while the storage is not yet technological ready to help. And I don't know when that is. Is that in 10 years? Is that in 15 years? No one can give you the answer there. I mean, everyone is working on that, but we cannot just say, let's turn everything else off, as the Germans do right now. They turn off the nukes in the hope that then at some point soon they have all the other bits and pieces in place in order to have a stable grid. In my view, that's criminal, what they do. It's the most unserious, unprofessional, unhumanly energy policy part of the German system at the moment. Everything else, I can say, okay, here were the mistakes, and that's why the dependence with the Russian gas and so. You can talk about that, and I understand why they got where they got. But when it comes to turning off nukes and not having the new ready and turning the old off, and now having to save the day with coal plants again that need to come out of the grid reserve, which is also not so easy, because you need the employees, you need to call in it's all very operational in reality on the ground to get these things done. It's very quickly written. Let's get it out of the grid reserve. It's not so easily done. That, in my view, is incomprehensible to me, and I have absolutely no sympathy for whatever is going on there. Now, besides that, the strategy, so to speak, to turn off coal by 2035, which is written in law in Germany, and not to have the nukes, and to scale down the gas, which they are allowed to have later on as part of the energy mix, but in a very contained manner, in my view, is not going to work as a proposal. I don't think any engineer will ever engineer it there. I'm talking in 3030, I'm not talking 2050. I'm talking never will they get there. And I'm quite convinced, because we do these numbers and we look at these things in detail, and it's just very hard. When it comes to the expansion of the transmission line, on which they work for 15 years, they are nowhere, right? Why? Because no one wants a transmission line in the backyard. And for as long as we are democracies, I have sympathy for that, because I don't want a transmission line either in my backyard. So I think we have to become realistic again, what works and why. And we have already invented it. We don't need to do new things. If we are not comfortable with the nuclear energy when it comes to security of generation 2 or 3, I say, let's build generation 4. They only become better. Everyone is working on it. Let's build the safest nuclear power plants, that are out there, and let's invest in R&D there to make sure that everyone has access electricity. Because in my view, what we need is not just a grid that is stable and that works, and that we are struggling now because of some of the decisions that were made not just in Germany, but in other parts too. And because we're all connected now, we suffer all from the same problem that one part created, which is insane. But what we also need to be aware is that I think we need cheap prices. At the prices today, the average bakery will go bankrupt. Is that the innovation of the 2023 year, that we cannot produce cheap electricity anymore because we have a reduction of choices that now comes down to a few things that are good and everything else is bad. Well, I think people will adapt their opinion when it comes to good and bad very quickly, when they cannot afford the electricity or when they have their first blackouts. And then everyone will come back to the table and say, guys, hold on, what are we talking here? Is this just about CO2? When we, as Europeans, cannot anyway decide what the CO2 mix will be of this planet long term, right? Because it's the most CO2 emissions created are all, not just in absolute, but in relative more terms, is all happening in China and India. So we're not going to change the climate in Europe whatsoever. That doesn't mean we don't want to become better in what we do, but it's certainly better is not to create a system that doesn't work. Not for the people, not for the prices that people pay, and not for the security of the grid. So we need a lot of change, no doubt.
And I think that
This is so direct, I can explain a lot more about it, and I tweeted a lot more. Maybe you can hint to your audience there, and so that they don't think we are some emotional maniacs that have feelings here.
No, certainly not. And I think that the way you finished your last sentence was also a perfect end of this very, very long conversation, by the way. I want to point to your Twitter profile. For those who are not following Alexander, please do so under Burggraben H. So you will find Alexander under Burggraben H. All one word, and he's posting a lot of information and analysis on his Twitter account, where he's doing these long threads I'm a big fan of. And I tend to say, just to finish our conversation on a positive note, that more or less political reality is constructed, and every constructivist has a plan until they get punched in the face by realpolitik. So I'm not worried that at some point of time in the future there will be adaptations to
exactly
the energy policy of the one or other country.
I couldn't agree more. I think that's exactly what happens. I think now people start also, 3 years ago, if I would have sent out a long thread on the electricity grid of Europe, I probably would have had 2 likes and no one would have, and 5 people reading it. Now people engage. There are thousands of retweets and discussions and livelihood about it. So people start to want to understand what is at hand here. I see a lot of threads now picking up some of the ideas that we, started to talk about a year ago, which is fantastic. So I think people start to educate themselves. The press calls me, some very large names in Germany say, okay, let's do a series of articles explaining it to our audience. And then I think the Germans also will come around and say, hold on a moment. I mean, Merkel said this, and then the Green Party says this, and so on. But the reality looks slightly different. My bill here looks very different. Oh, and now we're not sure we even have electricity. Come on, this is all ridiculous. And I think the industry leaders now start to become more courageous when it comes to speaking up. So it probably needs pain for the political process to become more realistic again. And then I think we can adapt very quickly because the elements are all in place. We don't need to reinvent ourselves. We can become better. And we became better over hundreds of years, immeasurably better. And I think we will continue to do that. So I'm very optimistic. It's just we have a big bump ahead of our road and we need to go through that.
So thank you very much. We managed even to end this conversation on an optimistic note rather than a pessimistic one. And let's agree to gather together in a year from now to also look back to what you've got right, and how your assessment for 2023 may have changed. So thank you very much. And as I said, please follow Alexander on Twitter. You will not gonna miss any relevant information regarding the so important commodities that he has covered for us in this very long conversation. Take care, Alexander, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Fantastic, Velina. Thanks for having me. It was very nice.
Thank you very much.